So this independent system-wide evaluation provides in-depth analysis on two critical elements of the 2018 repositioning of the UN development system. It looks at the extent to which the cooperation framework has become the most important planning and implementation instrument for the UN at the country level. And then secondly, the extent to which UN country teams have been reconfigured so they've got the capabilities that are needed to respond to the priorities set out in a cooperation framework. In terms of alignment and derivation, we found that generally these are an administrative exercise and they don't make a lot of difference. So whilst entities' country programs are broadly aligned with cooperation framework, there's little evidence that the substance of their programs is significantly affected by the cooperation framework process. In practice, there is little change. And the way that entities have to show that their programs are derived and their country plans are derived can cause friction that doesn't really drive substantive derivation. Secondly, on configuration, that is ensuring that the UN country team has got the capabilities to implement the cooperation framework. UN country teams are supposed to undertake configuration exercises, and we found these to be largely administrative exercises and that they're generally disconnected from entity decision points on country level resourcing. So these exercises have not really led entities to changing their country presence. However, positively, we see that configuration exercises have tended to increase engagement of non-resident agencies in country teams. Thirdly, in terms of implementation of cooperation frameworks, now this is the most important part. It's what is practiced, what happens. And we found that implementation of the commitments in a cooperation framework is uneven. The way joint work plans, joint resource mobilization strategies are implemented and the coordination structures, but they're all relatively weak. And we didn't really see the delivery of more prioritized, strategic and coherent sets of interventions following the development of a cooperation framework. Now, I've been really high level in making these statements. There's a huge amount more detail in the report itself. So again, I would urge you to read it. Turning now to the factors which explain this, there are some key challenges relating to a cooperation guidance and the MAF in terms of clarity and their application. HQ and regional support systems have focused on the design phase and technical levers with less attention to horizontal and external engagement that facilitates coherent CF implementation. And thirdly, increased joint programming and more coherent or strategic approaches do exist, but they're usually more attributable to UNCT member and RC leadership than to technical processes and instruments. And finally on this slide, UNSDG entity buy-in to the reforms is weaker at HQ and regional levels. Overall, UNSDG entities have not fully integrated the necessary accountabilities and incentives within their own structures. Turning now to the broader enabling environment and systemic factors. Competition and limited transparency within UN country teams are major impediments. National engagement in CF cycles is critical to ensure full alignment and coherence and is a key driver of UN country team coherence, but this is a variable. The existing governance arrangements of the UNDS with entity-specific oversight are a limiting factor. Finally, funding pressures and donor approaches at country level are also an important impediment, fragmenting efforts and undermining coherence. So let's now look at the overarching conclusions. So overall, the evaluation concluded that this vision for a new generation of country teams, guided by and configured around a cooperation framework, is necessary and it is relevant to optimizing the way the UN supports the 2030 agenda. And it's clear that the overall design and the strategic intent of reform is logical. So the ambition stands. We also found that some aspects of the reforms have really improved the quality and coherence of UN country teams. And I'll just give a few examples. The common country analysis has provided a much stronger basis for planning. And these are valuable for bringing the UN country teams together around a common kind of understanding. There's also really widespread appreciation for the delinking of the position of a resident coordinator and that change. And these are real foundations and key foundations on which to build. However, overall, progress has been incremental, and there is a significant gap between the strategic intent and the operational realities, i.e. what happens on the ground. So to kind of sum up, the cooperation framework has not yet become what it's supposed to be, which is the most important instrument for the planning and implementation of UN development activities in each country. And UN country teams have not yet significantly reconfigured in line with the cooperation framework priorities. The evaluation makes recommendations in 7 strategic areas. They cover instruments and systems that support implementation of the reforms, enabling issues across the UN system, and the more external enabling environment, including governance and funding. The intention is that they are addressed together as a holistic set to achieve maximum impact. The recommendations have got different targets. Some are to DCO, some to the UNSDG collectively, some are to individual UNSDG entities, and some are for member state consideration. So let's look at the first recommendation, or area for recommendation, and this is recalibrating the approach to cooperation framework cycle delivery. The evaluation recommends some really substantial changes in the cycle, and it recommends a shift of focus from the design phase and compliance with processes to facilitation of coherent delivery in the implementation phase. And this recalibrated approach keeps the ambition of increasing alignment. Entities must still demonstrate this alignment and report on the totality of their country level activities. We're not suggesting rolling back these ambitions. However, the evaluation recommends simplification and removing some requirements and replacing them with new mechanisms and approaches. And it also recommends that some key friction points that don't add value should be removed. And that includes removing the need for a detailed results framework in the joint work plan and replacing it with something that's much more focused. And also removing this requirement for the RC to certify that an entity has copied and pasted CF outcomes into a program document. We don't see that as fruitful. But these should be replaced with a concentration on more focused set of strategic initiatives in response to the highest national priorities. And that there should be, and this is really critical, real-time transparency between UN country team members and resident coordinators on their work plans and on resource mobilization efforts during the implementation phase. And this should cover all activities. So this is something which is new and we think should really facilitate stronger UN country team working. So turning now to UN country team configuration, the evaluation concludes that the tools that are used to reconfigure inverted commas UN country teams in practice don't meet the ambition for more tailored, responsive, agile, dynamic UN country team configuration. Configuration exercises at country level have really been one-off and mostly paper-based sort of tick box exercises. They're not effective and they're not realistic. And this is partly because the exercises themselves are disconnected from where entities make decisions. It's also due to structural and systems barriers that limit agility. So what we're recommending is enhancing country level analysis of presence and capacities as a basis for decision making, raising UN country team configuration discussions and decision making so they happen at the appropriate levels, i.e. regional or headquarters. And then also at global and UNSDG level, there needs to be a more fundamental rethink of the models for presence and hosting and representation. So turning now to the third recommendation, and this is about the support systems for cooperation framework and UN country teams. Essentially what we're saying is coordination functions need to change from focusing on design, quality assurance and compliance and vertical reporting towards facilitation of implementation and horizontal engagement. So ensuring that coordination adds value and avoids unhelpful transaction costs. So we make 4 sub-recommendations, and the first of these is to revise the MAF and cooperation framework guidance, and most importantly to strengthen these horizontal accountabilities and transparency within country teams. And this is really a critical gap that's been highlighted by the evaluation. And secondly, to review DCO staffing and focus at headquarters and regional level, and to maximise support and incentives for those aspects of the RC role that add the most value, and to improve the responsiveness and delivery focus of regional UNSDG mechanisms. And then finally, to streamline and refocus monitoring of the QCPR implementation process. So to reduce transaction costs and the sort of focus on process, over 200 indicators are reviewed and information is requested on these. So turning now to the 4th recommendation, and this really addresses accountabilities and incentives within UNSDG entities themselves. So, our evaluation found that entities have adjusted their policies and processes and they report on implementation of reforms to varying extents. But the evaluation concluded that the kind of pre-reform accountabilities and incentives have not really changed significantly or in the way needed. And it finds that there needs to be a step change with stronger integration of reform ambitions, so that coordination and collaboration isn't seen as kind of extra work or intention with the entity's corporate accountabilities and incentives, but that becomes the real work or part of the real work the entity is trying to promote. And this needs to happen at all levels. So we've got some quite specific recommendations and sub-recommendations. So then there needs to be stronger integration of reforms in strategic planning, in results frameworks and in internal guidance. There needs to be revised performance management systems within entities, and there needs to be an appraisal process for the RC and the UN country team and system-wide working. So using, for example, 360 feedback approaches. So there's a whole raft of changes that entities can introduce into their own systems and ways of working that make working within the UN country team part of the kind of daily bread and butter and incentivizes staff and structures to engage in a more meaningful way. So we're now taking a kind of step back from the country level and looking at some of the institutional blockages or obstacles. And one of them is, it relates to business innovations and efficiencies. Now, these weren't a focus of the evaluation, but they emerged as a major constraint to the approaches that support the new generation of country teams. So what we recommend is that the Business Innovations and Efficiencies group kind of accelerates the work it's doing so that it focuses on those aspects of change that will help UN country teams work better together. And for example, the full application of mutual recognition. And this recommendation is also important for the CEB and the HLCM. So the 6th recommendation, an area of recommendation, is on funding, the enabling kind of context. So funding quality is a critical enabler or constraint. And member states' fulfillment of their funding compact commitments is really key to the reforms being effective. The evaluation asks member states to ensure their country level staff are fully aware of the funding compact and apply it in their grant making. And on the UN side of a compact, we suggest a stronger role for the resident coordinator in joint resource mobilisation for UN country team priorities, for example through enhanced country level funding dialogues. The final area of recommendation relates to member state engagement and oversight. The evaluation concludes that member states aren't consistently holding the UN development system to account for collective rather than individual entity performance. And we make recommendations to member states in their different capacities. So as programme country governments, governments can set out clear expectations for collective UN delivery in line with a cooperation framework to get better results. We saw earlier that the engagement, the level of interest from a programme country government can have a strong influence on the degree of alignment. As governing bodies, member states should more consistently hold entities accountable for their system-wide performance, not just their entity performance. And then as individual member states, it will be beneficial for them to ensure a more coherent approach across the governing and legislative bodies. So almost like singing from the same hymn sheet, having policies and talking points that are aligned across the different places that they are represented. Thanks for watching this presentation. You can find the full evaluation report and a summary report on the System-Wide Evaluation Office website.